ever get the chance to discuss the hidden queerness of 1950s literature with a super gay English professor, I highly recommend it. Hello, my name is Margaret Adele, and welcome to a rambling discussion, because I just really need to talk about the hidden queerness of this book. Well, not maybe so hidden. It actually felt pretty blatant, to be honest. But today I'm going to talk about The Haunting of Hill House by Shirley Jackson. I actually stumbled across this book purely because I am taking part in a readathon, the realm of the readathon, and the team I am on is spooky. I don't know why I went with the spooky team. I don't read a lot of spooky books, but the people, they were just very persuasive. So I joined the team and I was like, I haven't really been reading a lot of spooky books and I have a lot of housework and I felt bad. So I was like, okay, I'll go on Libby. I'll look for whatever spooky audiobook I can find that seems short enough to make work. And of course, The Haunting of Hill House came up. And so I was like, seems cute enough. It's supposed to be like the haunted house story. Not the first, but like the one that I guess like popularized the genre in horror fiction, I suppose. And granted, the book is very different than the TV series. I have only heard some things about the TV series from like some of the media critics I follow, but I do know that it's very different, and I do need to preface here. In the book, none of the characters are related. None of them. So, when I talk about things like shipping and couples, no one in the book is related. It's different than the TV series. I'm not shipping incest here. Just want to make that very clear. But as I got into it, the first moment that two characters specifically meet each other, I had to remind myself that this book was written in the 50s. I believe it was published in 1959, and I was like, they're not going to end up together. Because my first instinct was, they're totally going to end up together. And I posted about this on my Twitter, and that's when one of the indie authors that I've reviewed before, Travis Boudon, the super gay English professor I talked about in the cold open, messaged me, and we were talking about it, and he goes, you have to message me when you're done with it. I want to talk about it. And so I did, and it was a super fun conversation. I always love getting to talk with people with something they're passionate about, and he actually like leads lessons and does this as part of his class. And so he's really, really familiar with the book, although we did have a lot of differing opinions. And he's the one that told me that actually the audiobook is one of the best ways to imbibe the story, because Bernadette Dunn, the audiobook narrator, just does a fantastic job. And I had to agree with him, mostly because when I went to read the e-copy, because whenever I get an audiobook, I also get some kind of e-copy to go along with it for like double checking, note-taking purposes, whatever. When I tried to read the same kind of flowery, daydreamy language of the protagonist in the e-copy, it was so much harder. So that would be my first recommendation, is if you're gonna like consume this story, go for the audiobook version with Bernadette Dunn. This story is old enough, and I think the audiobook is old enough that it will likely be available in your digital library as well, if your library does that kind of thing. But essentially, this book is all about a professor who's studying the paranormal, who wants to study the famous Hill House, who has all the stories around it, and he decides that he needs interns, basically someone else to be there to take notes on the stuff that's happening around them. So he looks up basically every case of paranormal phenomena he can find and the people attached to it, and basically just sends out a bunch of letters to all the people attached to it and being like, hey, would you want to do this? And he gets 2 people responding, and then the family who owns the house requires him to take on a third person from the family to kind of be there to oversee things. So we get our little foursome in the property, and right off the bat, Eleanor, when she comes to the house, she's on her own, she's kind of spooked out, but then the other quote-unquote intern comes, Theodora, and I swear to you, this was such a meet cute that I honestly forgot for a second that this book was written in the 50s and thought they were going to end up together. Like, that's how strong it was. I had to like double check the publication date to make sure, like, oh no, they're probably not going to end up together. And granted, part of the vibes you might get from the group early on is there for the sake of tension, because it is a group at a haunted house, and this style of haunted house story is much more psychological. It's not necessarily, the ghost of a girl in a Victorian dress standing in the corner type of haunted. It's more insidious and psychological. So it stands to reason that the group at the beginning has to have a kind of camaraderie about them, so that when the house slowly starts sinking its claws into their brains and starts putting a rift between them, it becomes a lot more noticeable. But even so, just even so, the ways that Eleanor thinks about Theodora early on, it's just a vibe. It's just a vibe. It's gals being pals turned up to 10. And this is more exacerbated by the fact that Theodora just screams lesbian in a way that few book characters do outside of those that are explicitly queer, specifically because she has this roommate. And the relationship she has with this roommate seems very passionate. Theodora first comes to Hill House because of a fight with the roommate, and this fight becomes very passionate and is this gigantic thing, and it's definitely the kind of fight that you don't necessarily have with just someone that's a good friend and a roommate. But even more so, this is compounded by the fact, and one of the big things that I was like, I swear this author knows what she's doing. Later on, when Theodora is trying to talk about her house and the way that they've made up their house and all that kind of stuff, and she talks about it in such a way that Eleanor asks, "Oh, are you married?" And Theodora says no, and then Eleanor gets awkward and drops it. And like that moment, you're like, the author has to know what she's doing. I literally was looking up her bio to be like, did she like come out as queer late in life? Like what? Like it was just such a vibe, and there's such underpinnings to all of it. And even, I'm going to do some spoilers here. I'm not going to spoil like the big events, the big scary things. There were some fun moments. The whose hand was she holding moment. Oh, spooky. I love it. Of course, as the house starts to like sink its claws into their minds, and Eleanor specifically, starts to like want to turn on them, even the way she turns on the others in her mind is so passionate. She loves them dearly from first glance. It's supposed to be like in a friend way, but like, but even when the house starts like affecting her mind, she hates them passionately. Like she never feels mid towards them. She never feels apathetic towards them. It's always instant connection. And she even notes it's an instant connection. She talks about how she has a problem getting to know people. She struggles getting to know people. But Theodora and Luke, it's simple. It's easy. The foursome falls into a camaraderie early on, seemingly without any issue. And then when it turns, it's gigantically big, passionate feelings. And it kind of plays with, Eleanor has like a crush type thing on Luke, or feels jilted by Luke later on. But like, it doesn't have half the amount of passion or the emphasis on how easily they get along that her and Theodora has. Although Travis does tell me that a lot of people, when they ship characters from the book specifically, again, no one's related in the book, most people actually go for a polycule, a triad with Theodora, Eleanor, and Luke all together. And I was like, usually I'm for a polycule, love me a good triad romance, but I'm just not feeling it here. I'm not feeling it. I feel like if there's any polycule situation here, it's definitely Eleanor and Theodora are the couple, but like they sometimes invite Luke over for some fun. Like that's the vibe I get, which also works better with his character, because the character of Luke is supposed to be like a cad, a rake. Well, they don't say a rake, but you know what I mean. That kind of womanizing type. So like I feel like that fits their vibe more, just a little bit more. And also, So later on in the book, again, we're getting some spoilers. The character of Dr. Montague's wife, Mrs. Montague, shows up. Travis loves her to death. I hate her. It was like, I was like, okay, because like I'm like, okay, someone's probably gonna die in this haunted house book. Probably. Can it be Mrs. Montague? She's obnoxious, and she's such a stereotypical married woman that, again, I was like, did this author know? Genuinely, did she know? Because the person who is the most like traditional character of the bunch, or at least the most vocally traditional about men should be this and women should be this, is also the most obnoxious and horrible. And the people who like low-key gals will be pals, like free love vibes, were the more protagonisty side. Like, I swear the author was trying to like send out some kind of message. And I had a lot of fun talking with Travis about all of this. You know, English professor, super gay. I've read a lot of his work. I'm not sure which of the English professor protagonists of his work is his more accurate self-insert, but I am like 90% sure one of them is. And if you are interested in some good gay English professor fun, I will put my links to the review videos of his work down in the description. But we were talking for a while, and he loves how obnoxious she is. And to be fair, Bernadette Dunn in the audiobook just perfect. Just does so well. She embodies all of the characters really well. She does the writing style really well, because this is written in that 1950s style where the idea of putting thoughts in italics had not quite become the norm in literature, but Eleanor is thinking things in italics, or thinking things in general, constantly. She is daydreaming constantly, and it's not in italics, it's not even in quotation marks. So like, it can get kind of jarring because it'll switch to her daydreams like mid-paragraph, and you're like, no, wait, what? Like, almost like a magical realism style, but it's not magical realism. I do love her daydreams. There are certain points where it actually follows on her entire trek to Hill House, from the home where she lives with her sister to Hill House, and every single stop she makes, and how wonderful it is to be free and traveling. And it's a whole thing. It's a gigantic whole thing in her head, how wonderful and marvelous and new, and this is the beginning of a new world for her, a new Eleanor for her to go to Hill House, which of course again plays into the sadness and tragedy of when everything starts to go wrong, and why the house starts to sink its claws into her brain, and how her life was before. It's definitely a tragic element that also kind of relates to a lot of the queer books in this era, because there were queer people in media to a certain extent in mostly the 60s, but sometimes the early 50s. However, the trick was that one, it was always super pulpy fiction. It was not meant to be taken seriously, and also it was always tragic. The queer characters always died in usually some horrific fashion, so that the mainstream media, should they lock eyes on this book and gasp and clutch the pearls, the author had plausible deniability to be like, no, I wasn't supporting these super hot women getting together. Look, one of the hot ones dies. Like, it was horrible at the time that queer authors had to hide their queerness beyond supposed moral standards by killing off their own characters, but it was very popular, and again, it led into the author, maybe? Has she been blocked by Lauren Huff on Twitter? Friend of Dorothy's? I don't know. And I have to say, I wish there was more of the book in general. I feel like there wasn't enough. Granted, it's a novella. I believe the e-copy said like 150 pages or something. The audiobook was way longer. I did listen to it at 1.5 speed, which I know is like slow for other people, but it is the fastest I have ever gotten an audiobook to go without feeling like I've lost something, because I've gotten to the point where I can't listen to an audiobook at regular speed. It will feel too slow because I know I can read faster than an audiobook goes. But again, Bernadette Dunn does a fantastic job with the text. And so I feel like in this case, racing through it, you would lose something. Her voice for Mrs. Montague and how she narrates Eleanor's daydreams, it's so great. There's a lot of that. I got a lot of Agatha Christie vibes with like talking in the parlor about the spooky things going on type of things. And the spooky things themselves, they're much more less than I was expecting. Of course, there were some creepy moments, but it's one of those things where the whole house itself is the entity. It's not an entity in the house. It's basically meant to be like, this whole house is evil and its history is evil, but also its history is a little gay because there is, in the history of the house, a pair of sisters who fought over it, the ownership of it, after their father had passed. And one of them, who actually got ownership of the house, hired a companion from the local village. And companion itself was a real, well, I guess sometimes today is still a real position, mostly for the super rich that can afford to literally buy a friend. But I've always held that I want to see, specifically sapphic, because it was usually a job held by a woman, romances coming out of this kind of idea of companions. And in this book, I could well imagine it, because after the sister dies, she dies heirless, no children, the house goes to the companion. She gives up, like she gives the ownership of the house, of Hill House, to the companion, not her sister. Not the other sister. No. She says, my companion is my heir. Vibes. So many vibes. And it makes me like want to find out what other subtle queerness is in some other books. And I know other people are going to be like, Oscar Wilde, but Oscar Wilde was not subtle. I do want to read, or at least listen to, The Picture of Dorian Gray for its queerness, but that's, the dude all but shouted it from the rooftops. There's really nothing questioning about that. Anyway, I really liked this book. There are still a lot, even if you've gone all this way and you're like, Margaret, you've spoiled things. Well, I said I was going to. But even if you're still interested in it, there's still a lot of stuff to read. I wish it was longer. I would have liked maybe a little bit more psychic phenomenon, maybe a little bit more emphasizing Eleanor's turn for essentially starting to fall in love with the house. Like, it was so good. I loved how Mrs. Dudley, who is the caretaker, she's autistic coded. Definitely autistic coded, based on the way that she is like stringent about those times. And you think like, oh, she's stringent because she wants to get out of the house before nightfall because house is, haunted and spooky and stuff. But like, no, like anytime the characters dared to try and eat their meals past when she was scheduled to clean up, was not going to happen. That's not what I agreed to. Like, and she would just repeat, breakfast is out at 9, I clean up at 10. Like, she would just repeat that constantly. I'm like, I'm getting some coding, just like vibes. This book in general holds up surprisingly well for a modern audience, especially given that it was made in the 1950s, and the concept of, sharing ownership of a car that you barely ever drive because it's parked in a garage in the middle of the city because you don't use it type of things. Like, there are some things that are definitely different culturally, but for the most part, holds up surprisingly well. I don't know that I agree that it is the haunted house story. I think that's more of it began something and then the legacy of its own self surpassed it, which I've seen a lot before. I've read the Stepford Wives, which was also supposed to be one of those like groundbreaking things, and it's definitely one of those you can see why it's groundbreaking, but we've definitely surpassed it since then, which, like, no shade, I would hope that we have like come up with other story ideas and progressed story ideas since the 1950s. I would hope we've done that. In general, great book, loved it. If you loved the TV series, you probably will still like it. Again, it doesn't go as hard as the TV series. There's not like the familial trauma to as big of an extent. There is some dysfunctional family stuff in Eleanor's past, but for the most part, you're not going to get as hard hitting with the trigger warning type content that you do in the Netflix series. I know there's also like a old black and white movie version of it that I think is more accurate to the book. I don't know. But that's also, I think, made during the Hays Code. So I don't know how much I'd like that movie in general. I don't like Hays Code movies. I don't like the Hays Code. I blame it for a lot of our struggles with media literacy today. Regardless, thank you so much for following me on this rambling discussion. I really enjoy these. I want to get into more just not necessarily reviews, not necessarily like challenges, but just, hey, this book was cool. Let's sit and talk about it for a while. So if there are any other books you think have like hidden queerness, maybe written at a time when people couldn't be overt, but definitely there's a vibe, please let me know. I'd be really interested to read that. And also, Travis, I know you're reading this. Our conversation was a lot of fun, and obviously I'm sure you would have the ins on old literature with hidden queerness, so you can feel free to DM me on that list at any time. It would not be the first list of queer media things you've DM'd me. We have a great friendship. Regardless, with nothing else to say, I hope you have a wonderful day and a marvelous tomorrow.